Hi, thank you for clicking on this video and seeing you again. My name is Spectraclaw. I am your Jaguar Priestess that goes into video analysis. I am going to tell you this with a heavy heart. This video is not easy. So here's your content warning now. This video discusses grooming, child exploitation, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, trauma, manipulation involving minors, and poverty. And some crucial details about my life that also are very uncomfortable. If this isn't for you, I'm telling you now, you should click off of this video. For those that are willing to stay, let's get into it. One of the most interesting aspects of Denji as a protagonist is how aggressively he resists the traditional image of a sympathetic victim. He's vulgar, impulsive, hypersexual, emotionally immature, at times selfish, shallow, and reckless. Some of the things he says makes audiences uncomfortable. He often reduces his desires into crude sexual language, and because of that, many viewers flatten him into a joke. The horny Chainsaw Man protagonist, the guy whose motivation is touching boobs, the degenerate shonen lead. But I think reducing Denji to a comic relief fundamentally misunderstands what Chainsaw Man is actually doing with his character. Because Denji is not simply written as a parody of adolescent male desire. He's written as a study in deprivation. More specifically, Denji is a portrayal of what prolonged poverty, emotional neglect, bodily exploitation, and grooming can do a young person's understanding of intimacy, identity, and self-worth. And I think the discomfort some audiences feel towards Denji is intentional, because he doesn't perform victimhood in a socially recognizable way. His trauma is not quiet or aesthetically palatable, it's messy, sexual, awkward, immature, and ultimately contradictory, which is precisely why he feels psychologically authentic to me. And personally, that authenticity is why his character affects me so deeply and why I could not only sympathize but empathize, because I recognize parts of myself in the confusion he experiences between affection, desire, safety, and control. Before Chainsaw Man becomes a narrative about devils or state violence, it begins as a narrative about poverty. Not stylized poverty, not romanticized poverty, structural poverty. The kind that reduces a human being to pure survival. When the audience first meets Denji, he exists outside the normal developmental structures associated with adolescence. He's not receiving an education, he has no familial support system, no stable housing, no meaningful socialization, and no emotional safety. Instead, he inherits debt from his deceased father and becomes economically exploited by the Yakuza as a child laborer. Importantly, the series repeatedly emphasizes Denji's willingness to sell parts of his own body in order to survive. His eye, his kidney, even one of his testicles, but that doesn't stop this one-note wonder. These details are often framed through dark comedy, but psychologically they establish something essential about Denji's relationship to and with himself. His body has never belonged to him. From childhood onward, Denji internalizes that the idea that his body is transactional, a tool. It can be traded, damaged, consumed, or sacrificed for survival. And this becomes crucial to understanding his later relationship with intimacy and sexuality, because Denji does not grow up understanding affection as a mutual emotional connection. He understands his worth through utility and utilitarian means. If he performs labor, he gets to eat. If he obeys, he survives. If he makes himself useful, he provides temporary comfort. This creates what psychologists might describe as a deeply conditional understanding of love and care. Affection is not expressed as inherent, it's earned through usefulness, and that framework profoundly distorts Denji's emotional development. So when Denji becomes fixated on physical intimacy, this series is not merely making a joke about teenage hormones. It depicts emotional deprivation translated into desire. His dreams are painfully small. because survival has constrained his ability to imagine or want anything bigger. Bread with jam, a warm bed, human touch, a girlfriend. These are not grand ambition. These are mere teenage wants and experiences that come with growing up in normal society. But these survival fantasies are reframed as intimacy. One of the most psychological interesting aspects of Denji's characterization is how Chainsaw Man uses sexuality not as empowerment, but as emotional miscommunication. At first glance, Denji appears to embody a familiar anime archetype, the hormonally driven teenage boy whose desires are primarily sexual, which we've seen in other characters like Soul from A Soul Eater, Natsu from Fairy Tail even. However, the narrative gradually reveals that Denji's sexuality is inseparable from emotional starvation. He does not actually understand the distinction between being desired, being loved, being valued, and being used. This especially comes clear during the sequence involving power. Denji initially frames touching her chest as a transformative goal that would be life-changing, almost transcendent in importance. But when the act finally occurs, he feels empty. That scene is critical because it destabilizes Denji's assumption about intimacy. The experience fails to satisfy him because physical contact alone was never the core desire. What Denji truly wanted was emotional recognition, connection, mutual vulnerability, affection without conditions. But Denji lacks the emotional vocabulary necessary to articulate those needs directly. He can't comfortably say, I'm lonely, I want emotional safety, I want to be loved, embraced. So those needs become displaced into sexual language instead. And I think this aspect of his characterization is particularly realistic, especially for traumatized adolescents, especially for boys. Many young men are socialized to convert emotional vulnerability into sexual pursuit, especially through their partners, because sexuality is often socially the only framework acceptable through which they're permitted to express longing for intimacy. And as a result, Denji repeatedly mistakes desire for care, and that confusion becomes the foundation upon which his exploitation occurs and consistently does. Before I want to discuss Makima specifically, I think it's important to define grooming because the term is often misunderstood in public discourse or thrown around. The concept of child grooming was heavily studied and popularized by psychologists and abuse researchers such as Anna Salter to describe the gradual process which predators establish emotional dependency, trust, compliance, and psychological attachment prior to exploitation. Importantly, grooming rarely begins with overt violence. It starts with emotional attunement, attention, praise, protection, validation, monetary support, or maybe material support. The predator identifies an unmet emotional need within the victim and positions themselves as being able to fulfill it. And this is what makes grooming psychologically devastating to the victim because it often feels indistinguishable from love, particularly when the victim is isolated, financially vulnerable, neglected, or desperate for stability. And this is one reason why Denji's story resonates with me personally. I recognize that confusion intimately. When I was younger, I experienced grooming myself. The first time I was 12 years old, and the second time I was 13, and the individual was 22, and a family friend. And at the time, I didn't possess the conceptual language necessary to understand what was happening to me, because grooming rarely presents itself as a danger initially. It presents itself as safety, protection, stability, attention, a future. And when someone is emotionally vulnerable, particularly when poverty or instability are involved, these promises can feel indistinguishable from love and care, but they're not love. They're mechanisms of control that are disguised as care. And that is precisely what makes Makima such an effective portrayal of manipulative authority. Makima immediately recognizes Denji's psychological vulnerabilities, not because she empathizes with him, because she understands deprivation. She identifies a boy who has spent his entire life deprived of affection, stability, and recognition, and she weaponizes those absences. She provides food, shelter, purpose, physical closeness, and intermittent approval, but she provides them conditionally, and this is what makes her control so sinister to me, so evil, because she doesn't dominate Denji through fear. She dominates him through emotional dependency. She carefully regulates access to affection in order to sustain attachment. Too little warmth, he may detach, and too much, he may develop autonomy. So instead, she maintains him in a constant state of emotional hunger. And psychologically, this resembles intermittent reinforcement. This is a conditioned process in which inconsistent rewards strengthen the dependency more effectively than consistent ones. Denji becomes attached not because his needs are fulfilled, but because they're strategically withheld, just out of reach, on the tippy toppy shelf. And that's what makes this dynamic especially tragic, is that Denji interprets this manipulation as intimacy because he's never experienced healthy affection before. Makima understands that Denji confuses attention with love. So she transforms his unmet emotional needs into mechanisms of obedience. And I think that's one of the most disturbing aspects of Chainsaw Man. The series understands that exploitation does not always occur through explicit violence. Sometimes exploitation occurs through hope. One of the most fascinating aspects I can say is characterization for Denji is that emotionally he's not presented as a fully developed person at the beginning of the narrative. He survives but doesn't fully understand how to live as a human being. And symbolically, the story literalizes this through Pochita becoming Denji's heart. Denji's humanity is incomplete, not because he lacks moral potential, but because trauma has interrupted his emotional development. Throughout the series, he repeatedly questions whether he's capable of genuine empathy. When Aki and Power are in danger, Denji wonders whether their deaths would devastate him. And importantly, this is not framed as sociopathy. This is framed as emotional dissociation. Denji has spent so much of his life suppressing vulnerability in order to survive that he struggles to identify his own emotional responses. He consistently questions, am I human? Am I normal? Do I genuinely care about others? And gradually, through his relationships with Aki, Power, and Pochita, the answer becomes yes. And that's why I think that fundamentally, this is a story about humanization. Beneath horror and absurdity and gore, it's a narrative about a boy slowly learning that relationships do not have to be transactional, that care can exist without exploitation, and that affection can exist without ownership. And for Denji, these realizations are revolutionary. I think one of the reasons why audiences struggle with Denji is because he lacks what may be called sociable, legible victimhood. People are generally more comfortable with sympathizing with victims who feel fragile, innocent, restrained, or morally idealized. But like I've stated, his responses are messy. He's hypersexual, he's impulsive, emotionally mature, attention seeking, and that sounds selfish or crude, which I identify in myself. When I was being sexually abused and manipulated, I was hypersexual because I thought that this was a means of a way to get in control of what had happened to me. I was impulsive in my decision making and also doing things to regain any semblance of control as a victim. If that meant being destructive and over sexualizing myself to others, I'm sorry. Simply saying, I attention seeked. as a victim. And some people chose not to believe me. And some people thought, well, if this is the way that you act, then are you really deserving of help? But ultimately, trauma does not produce quiet suffering. It produces emotional dysregulation, validation seeking behavior, self destructive coping mechanisms. It doesn't make you graceful. And the same thing goes for Denji. It makes him hungry. Hungry for affection, hungry for stability, hungry for recognition, hungry for proof that he matters to somebody. I also think that Denji's story exposes the way that male victims of grooming and sexual exploitation are minimized or dismissed. Particularly when desire is involved, there exists a cultural assumption that boys inherently welcome sexual attention, especially from older women. And you hear it all the time when in the news they're victims of sexual abuse from teachers. But desire does not eliminate exploitation. A teenager can crave affection and still be manipulated through that craving. A person can feel attraction and still lack the power necessary to meaningfully consent in an unequal dynamic. And Denji exists almost entirely within unequal dynamics. The adults surrounding him consistently understand his emotional vulnerabilities better than he does himself. That imbalance matters. His attraction does not erase the manipulation. His desire does not erase the coercive structures surrounding him. Would people even recognize Denji as a victim if his trauma looked different? If he was quieter, more innocent, less sexual, less socially abrasive? Because victims don't become less real simply because their trauma responses are inconvenient or uncomfortable to witness. Denji is an imperfect victim. Say it with me. And that imperfection is precisely what makes him such a compelling character. He's not articulate, he's not morally idealized, he's not easy to defend. But none of these qualities negate his exploitation. If anything, they make his characterization feel more authentic. Denji is a child who learned that affection had to be earned through usefulness, through obedience, through performance, through access to his body. And as much as Chainsaw Man is fundamentally about him unlearning that belief, learning that connection does not have to be transactional, learning that connection can exist without manipulation, and that he possesses value beyond utility, is why his story is devastating. Because beneath all the violence and absurdity is a lonely boy trying to understand what love is supposed to feel like. And that tragedy is that most of the adults around him exploit that confusion instead of protecting him. Denji is not a perfect victim. He is something much more uncomfortable and much more human. He's a realistic one. I'm SpectreClaw. This has been a video on so many things important to me. I'm sorry that it was uncomfortable, because this discusses child grooming, child exploitation, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, trauma, manipulation involving minors, and poverty. And ultimately, I'm telling you now, this channel won't always be positive. But I will say I thank you for watching, and that it's worth talking about. And if you think that's true, then like this video, and I'll see you in the next one. SpectreClaw out.